I brought my suitcase here because I'm going to get to work. This is my job, so I thought I'd bring my suitcase. For visitors today, an empty water bottle up here. Thanks for leaving me some water, guys. For visitors today, this week is a little bit different, and I want to let you know that normally we will have a kids program that the kids can go to. This being the fifth Sunday of the month, we like to have our kids in here. We have kind of our whole family all together worshiping and singing and listening to a boring sermon. So we like to put our kids through the same stuff we have to go through. So that's going on this week. And it's also a little bit different because we're going through a series on why we believe, and we're encouraging you guys to text in your questions throughout the sermon to this number that's on the screen here. And kids, you can ask your parents to text in those questions, and then we're gonna talk about them at the end of the sermon, which is going to be in a couple minutes. It's not going to be too long. So, if we have a nursery available also for those of you who have little kids, and if your kid ends up going bonkers, you feel free to take them out. But also, we want to remind you that we love having kids in here. So, and we love having kids that go bonkers because we know that's what kids do. So, don't feel guilty about that. I really like that kind of stuff. So, different kind of sermon today, and like I said, I brought my suitcase in here. And it's going to be interesting because today we're trying to figure out why should we believe in Jesus. So we're going to have to put on our thinking caps like we did last week, and we're going to have to do some detective work. So in this suitcase, I have some evidence I want us to look at in a couple minutes. Evidence of why we would believe in Jesus. I had to go to court last week, and I had to go to the courthouse, and I had to sit on this chair, and I had to raise my right hand and swear to tell the truth, and the judge is watching me, and the jury's watching me, and there's lawyers watching me. I wasn't on trial. But why was I there? You might be wondering. Well, they wanted eyewitness testimony. And so what they do in these trials is they get people who saw something or who know something, and they want to hear from them. Eyewitness testimony is very important to have because if a person can say, oh, I was there, I know what happened, I saw what happened, I experienced what happened, well, that's very important stuff to know. And when you get a lot of people that all said that they were there at this time and they're all saying the same thing and they all saw the same thing, well, that's very strong evidence, what they like to say in the courthouse. And it helps us understand what happens. And you might not realize this, you young kids, but some things don't get recorded. Some things aren't on videotape. And so, or nothing's on videotape anymore. It's all on MP something. If something's not recorded, really the only way you can know that something happened is by somebody telling you what happened. Somebody who was there, who saw it, and is able to tell you. So we're asking a tough question this week, and last week we did, and next week we're going to ask another tough question. And the tough question is this: why do you believe, or why do we believe what we believe about Jesus? Not what do we believe about Jesus, but why do we believe that? We believe that Jesus is the Son of God. We believe that Jesus died for our sins. Well, that's good, but why do we believe that? That's a tough question. It's good to know what you believe, but it's also good to know why do you believe it. So this week we're asking, why do we believe Jesus? For many of us, the answer why we believe Jesus is simply, well, my parents told me about Jesus. Now, that's actually a great answer. That's a great reason. It's a great start, you could say. We learn a ton of stuff from our parents. We learn how to read from our parents. Hopefully. We learned our ABCs from our parents. We learned how to speak. We learned what words mean. We learned all sorts of great stuff from our parents. So it's perfectly okay for you to say, well, I believe in Jesus because my parents told me about Jesus and I trust my parents. That's a perfectly valid reason to believe something. If you are struggling with doubt, or when you get older, maybe you start doubting, hearing something from somebody is a good start, but sometimes you need a little bit more. Sometimes you need to dig a little bit deeper. But I do want to say that most of the things we know, we simply know because we've heard them from someone else. I have never been to New York. I've never been to New York. But I believe that New York exists. You can say, well, why do you believe New York exists? You've never been there. Well, people have been there and they told me about it. I kind of trust them. Does anybody know what the tallest mountain in the world is? Does anybody know? Somebody said Everest. Now, did you measure Everest? No, nobody here measured Everest, but we hear from people who did, and we trust them. So that's how we know a lot about a lot of stuff. So it's perfectly fine to say, well, the reason I believe is because I heard from someone who I trust. That's a totally valid reason to believe. We believe in most of the things we believe because of that very thing. We're not out there measuring Mount Everest and measuring all these things. We just trust the people who did. So it's an important that we hear from people who have been there and who saw certain things. And especially, like I said, it's very important when lots of different people say the same thing. When someone else says the same thing, that's very important reason to believe in something. So maybe we believe in Jesus because our parents told us or somebody told us or we trust them. But sometimes, like I said, you have to go a little bit deeper. So we're going to go a little bit deeper today. We're going to do a little bit of investigating. And this is good for when we run into questions, when we run into doubt. When you start doubting things, I wonder if Mount Everest really is the tallest mountain. Well, what should I do? I need to find out. I need to do something about it. Doubt's a very powerful thing. And when you doubt, here's the important thing to remember when you doubt. And doubting is totally okay, guys. But here's the important thing to remember. It's not enough just to doubt something. Some people think, and the younger you are, I think the more people tend to think this, especially teenagers. They think it's just okay just to doubt and then stop. I just kind of doubt everything. Well, doubting's only helpful when you try to learn what the answer is. A question is only helpful if you try to get what the answer is. So if you're doubting today, if you're having any questions, that's okay. That's a good first step. But the next logical step is, well, let me look for the answer. I've talked to so many people, and it always surprises me, where people doubt things and they question things, and they ask them, well, did you look for the answer? They say, well, no, not really. They say, well, maybe I wonder if Jesus is real. Well, that's interesting to wonder that, but did you ever look into it? Did you ever study it? No, not really. I was talking to a friend. I was at a friend's house. This was several years ago, and I was just getting really excited about Jesus. When I was young, I didn't think there were any answers out there about Jesus. And then when I got older, I found out there's all sorts of answers and reasons why we believe Jesus and know he's real. And I started getting excited, and I started reading all these books and going through all the history and finding all this evidence. And I was so excited, and I would tell people all about this because I didn't think anybody knew about this. And I was at my friend's house, and he was saying, well, I don't know. I don't think that he's real, and he was asking all these questions. And I was excited because I said, well, this is great because I know the answers to these questions. I've just been studying this. And I said, do you want to know the answers to all the questions that you just asked? And he says, no, not really. And I thought, oh, that's frustrating. What's the point of you asking all these questions? Don't you want the answers? So asking questions is great, but remember, look for the answers. So for us to dig deeper, we're going to need to think like detectives today because we want to know about Jesus. And the problem is Jesus lived a long time ago. He lived about 2,000 years ago. So we're going to have to look at what we call history. And maybe some of you are thinking, oh, no, I got to learn about history? Well, just for a couple minutes. There's really only two ways we can know about anything happened in history. One is by archaeology, like Indiana Jones. You dig up something. And actual archaeologists think that Indiana Jones was not a very good archaeologist. But there's real archaeologists out there, and they dig up things and they find things. They find old buried houses and bones, and they find all these things. So that's one way you can know about history. The only other way you can know about history is if somebody wrote it down and we still have their writing. If somebody was there and they said, hey, here's what happened, and that writing is still available to us today. So those are the two ways we can know about history. It's not like you can do a chemical test on history in the lab and figure out what happened. You have to do things differently. So what kind of things do we have? What kind of things have we found that tell us about Jesus? Well, let's look at archaeology first. What have people been digging up? Let's look at some of the things that were going on around the time of Jesus. Here's a house from the town of Nazareth. Nazareth was where Jesus was born, and he wasn't born, he was born in Bethlehem, but he was raised in Nazareth. And a couple years ago, they dug up this house, and they said, hey, we found a house, and it's the exact same age, this house would have been around at the time of Jesus. It's all just rubble now, but they dug it up. Maybe this is Jesus' house. We don't know. It didn't have a sign that said, Jesus lives here. So we don't know. But there's archaeological evidence that say, yeah, Nazareth was a real place. There were real houses. In fact, you can go to Nazareth today. You can visit that place. We talk about Jerusalem all the time. You can go to Jerusalem. You can go out all these places. One of the other places in Jerusalem that's important is the temple. Lots of things happened with Jesus in the temple in Jerusalem. And so archaeologists have discovered, they've always kind of known that the temple was there, but this is kind of rubble from the temple in Jerusalem. Now, one of the interesting things about the temple, and maybe this is just for adults, but use your thinking caps on this. The temple, Jesus died in the year, say about 30. The temple was destroyed in the year 70. So the temple's been destroyed since the year 70 AD. So there's about 40 years after the time of Jesus. Now, the writings in the Bible talk about details that are in the temple and talk about things that are in the temple. And when archaeologists go through and they dig up the temple and they discover, oh, hey, the people who wrote in the Bible were right about these details. Now, the only way they could have known about the details was if they had seen these things before the year 70 AD, because the temple's been destroyed since 70 AD. So if they're writing about things that actually were there, that we're finding are actually true, that means they must have been witnesses. Somebody couldn't have written about them later because the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So you had to use your thinking caps there. Hopefully that was clear. So there's a house in Nazareth we found, a temple we found. Here's an interesting one, the next one. This house, this is a crazy. They discovered this in 1992. This house is in the town called Capernaum, and it's just, like I said, it's just rubble now. But this, most people think, was Peter's house. Peter was one of Jesus' followers, and there's reasons they believe that this is Peter's house. But I thought that's very interesting. Jesus would have met in that very place. He would have been with Peter. Just like the temple, he would have walked down those very roads in the temple. So that's a pretty interesting one. Here's another interesting one. This is all archaeological evidence for Jesus. This one has the name, if you can read Latin, it says something, but the people who can read Latin say to us that this says that Pontius Pilate was the governor in Judea at this time, the exact time that Jesus was there. And this was dug up just actually recently again, and they said, oh, we got evidence of all these people that knew Jesus and all these people that were around at Jesus' time. Real archaeological evidence. Very exciting stuff if you're a geek. Just a couple more. Here, somebody discovered this in the 1960s. If you can read Aramaic, this is a tomb. This is a coffin, and it's real fancy. This is the coffin of Caiaphas. They discovered the coffin of Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the man who sent Jesus to die. He was the leader of the Jews at the time. He's the leader of the Sanhedrin. And look, he's got a big old fancy tomb. And they found his bones inside. Maybe kind of gross, but kind of cool at the same time. Here, this one's very interesting. This is a plain coffin. They found this in 2002, very recently. This coffin, most people agree, belonged to James, the brother of Jesus. That's Jesus' brother's coffin. We found it, and his bones are still inside. Really crazy stuff. We have all this evidence to support this stuff. Another evidence that I'm not going to put up there is there's something called the Shroud of Turin. Nobody's really sure on the Shroud of Turin, but some people think it was the thing that they buried Jesus in, kind of the blanket they buried him in. But anyway, there's a debate about that one. So what do we know then? We know that these things that we're reading about in the Bible, they aren't just stories. These are real places. These aren't just made up things. They're actual places that took place in an actual time, and they're real people. It talks about real people, and we have all sorts of evidence that shows, oh yeah, they were right about the stuff that they were writing. So we don't just have the archaeological evidence, the things that we dig up. Remember the other kind of evidence that we also have, and that is people writing about what happened at the time. Now that's a very important thing. There was lots of people that wrote about Jesus, and some of the people who wrote about Jesus, we put it all together in this book, and we called the book the Bible. But if you rewind, let's pretend we're going on a time machine or something, and we're going all the way back to the time of Jesus. And at the time of Jesus, when people were writing about him, books, nobody invented a book yet. It sounds weird, but back then they had what they call scrolls. So people are just writing on these scrolls. And then when somebody invented the book, somebody said, hey, you know what? We ought to put all these scrolls together in a book, and we'll call it the Bible. But you picture before all that, everybody has just these scrolls, and there's lots of people that were writing about Jesus in the scrolls. So what kind of evidence do we have from the eyewitnesses? And remember, the eyewitnesses are very important. These are the people who were there, who saw him, who walked with him, who knew what was going on. So what kind of evidence do we have? And I got to pull out my briefcase here. So some evidence from the writings. Well, we have a writing from a man named Matthew, and that one got put in the Bible. These are all evidences or writings from people who were with him. Matthew was an apostle of Jesus. He followed Jesus around. Mark was another follower of Jesus. He followed actually Peter around. We have the writings of Luke, who followed Paul around. Paul was an apostle. We have the writings of John, who was an apostle. We have the writings of James, who was Jesus' brother. We have his writing. We have Jude, who was another brother of Jesus. We have Peter, who followed Jesus around too. We remember they found his house. We saw just a couple minutes ago. We have his writing. We have the writings of Paul, who was a follower of Jesus. And we have the writings of some guy who wrote what we call the book of Hebrews. He didn't put his name on it, so we just say whoever wrote Hebrews. But he wrote stuff down. We just don't know who exactly he was. So here's the kind of the eyewitness testimony. These are the people who knew about Jesus and who even followed around with the apostles. And I covered up my notes with all these. We got too much evidence here. So what are these people writing? Well, I put in the insert there, just kind of, this is how Luke starts off his eyewitness account. He says this in Luke chapter 1, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. So he's saying there's a bunch of people that have been writing about Jesus. He says, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Remember, Luke wasn't an apostle himself. He followed Paul around. He says, with this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So what's Luke saying here when he writes down what he's writing? He's saying, I investigated these things. He's writing actually to most excellent Theophilus. We don't know who Theophilus is, but he sounds like an excellent guy. So Luke's writing to him, and Theophilus has heard about Jesus, and Theophilus says, yeah, but how do I know it's true? And Luke says, well, I'll tell you what, I'll write down everything that I investigated. I talked to the eyewitnesses. I talked to the people who were around at Jesus' time. I have been working with Paul for years, and Luke says, so I investigated everything, and I put this all in an orderly account, and we call that the book of Luke. That's what we call the book of Luke. And we have it in the Bible here, and some people, I don't know why they don't like the Bible, but if you just remember, well, this was just a scroll at one point that a guy named Luke was writing. So we have all this evidence, and Luke was a trustworthy source because he knew all these people, and Luke, actually, his job was a doctor. He was a doctor, so he's a trustworthy guy. So we have all this evidence of people that were walking around with Jesus, but we don't just have that. We actually have other writings from people who knew the apostles. So there were the people who knew Jesus, and then we have writings from people that knew those people, so who still lived within the lifetime of that era. And so we have a lot of writings for this, and I'll go through these real quick. We have a writing from Polycarp, from Clement, a guy named Ignatius, Barnabas. Barnabas went with Paul, walked around with Paul. Aristides, Justin Martyr, Papias. He's got a fun name. I like Papias. We have Aristo of Pella. We have Theophilus of Antioch. We have Diognetus. And a couple more. We have Athenagoras. We have Melito of Sardis. And we have Quadratus. These are cool names. People had cool names back then. So we don't not only have writings of people who followed Jesus around, we have the writings of the people who knew those people. So the evidence is starting to mount, and all these people are writing within a lifetime of Jesus. So there's all people who are alive during the time of the eyewitnesses. So this might be getting a little bit boring, but I've got one more set of set of evidences here. And this is from people who knew about Jesus but didn't follow Jesus. All these guys were kind of followers of Jesus. We also have writings from people who were alive at the time of Jesus who didn't believe in Jesus, but who knew he existed. So these are some interesting ones. We have a writing from a guy named Josephus. He was alive at the time of Jesus, and he was a Jewish historian. We have writings from Tacitus, who was a Roman historian. He lived in Rome. He wrote about Jesus. He said there was a guy named Jesus, and he was crucified and all this stuff. We have a guy named Phlegon, who was a Roman historian. We have a guy named Suetonius, who wrote about Jesus. He's another Roman historian, all around the time that Jesus was alive. We have a guy named Pliny, or Pliny. I don't know how to pronounce Pliny. I've heard both ways. We got a guy named Celsus, who was a Roman philosopher. We got a guy named Lucian, he was a playwright. He was writing a play, and in one part of the play, he actually kind of makes fun of a guy named Jesus, who is this Jewish guy. So it's not nice to Jesus, but he was still writing about him. We got a guy named Marabar Serapion, who was a prisoner. He wrote a letter. We have his letter, and he mentions this guy named Jesus that was killed. And we got a guy named Thallus. Thallus was a Greek historian. And Thallus is actually an interesting one. In the Bible, it talks about when Jesus died, that blackness kind of covered the land. And Thallus lived really far away in Greece, and he's writing his history at the time. And at the same day that Jesus is dying, he has no idea about Jesus, but he says he's trying to figure out why the sky went black this day. And we have his writing, this historian. And the only thing he can figure out is there's some kind of eclipse that he doesn't know about. But when you look back at that actual day, you find out that it was impossible for there to have been an eclipse. The moon and the sun weren't lined up. So he thought there was maybe an eclipse, but the real reason was he didn't know it, but when Jesus died, the whole land went black. So really kind of interesting evidences. All these writings that discuss Jesus that were within a lifetime, or at least a lifespan of Jesus. So this is very powerful evidence. This is what we would call testimony, and testimony is very important to people if you ever go to court and everything like that. So historians, people who study history, these may be boring type people, they all agree that Jesus was real. There's an atheist historian who doesn't believe in God. His name is Bart Ehrman. He says this about if Jesus was real or not. He says, "This is not even an issue for scholars. There is no scholar in any college or university who teaches classics, ancient history, New Testament, or early Christianity who even doubts that Jesus existed. He is abundantly attested in early sources. Early, independent, eyewitness sources indicate that Jesus certainly existed." So it's not even a question anymore. Absolutely. We have plenty and plenty of evidence. That's certain. Jesus was definitely real. But why do we believe in Jesus? What, like the video said, so yeah, he existed. What about him is so special? Well, Jesus did something really amazing. That is, he died on a cross, just like a criminal would have died, and then 3 days later, he rose again. Now that's the amazing thing, that Jesus wasn't just a teacher. He claimed to be the Son of God, and then he proved that he was the Son of God by rising from the dead. And remember, all the eyewitnesses that were around that saw it say that this happened. They say that they saw him. And in fact, the followers of Jesus said, not only did we see him, but 500 people experienced Jesus. That's in 1 Corinthians. Paul writes that. There was 500 people that experienced Jesus after he died. And this, by the way, is one of the best answers to why we believe in Jesus. And that is because, well, Jesus rose from the dead. I believe in Jesus because he rose from the dead. Andy Stanley, one of my pastor I really enjoy listening to, he says, if a man can predict his own death and resurrection and pull it off, I just go with whatever that man says. I just follow him. This is why I believe in Jesus, because he rose from the dead. This is why I trust him. The only reason really I'm a pastor is because I believe that Jesus rose from the dead. I'm not a pastor because I like to help people. Helping people is okay, but it's kind of against my nature, honestly. I'm not a pastor because I'm a really nice person. There are much nicer people in this room than I am. And if you don't believe me, you just play a game with me, and you'll find out that I'm really kind of a mean person. Some parents they have this philosophy where they let their kids win games. I don't understand that. I never do that. If you play a game with me, it's die, live or die. I'm not a nice person. I'm a pastor because Jesus rose from the dead. That's it. That's why I believe. I think it's weird that people don't follow Jesus. If somebody rose from the dead, well, wait a second. That's a pretty powerful thing. I'm going to follow that guy. I was talking to a gal last week, and she was talking about coming to church. She said, I'd really like to check out the church. I want to know what you guys talk about. I've got kids, and I want to know what to tell them. And I said, well, honestly, who cares what I think? We don't talk in church about what I think. We point to this guy, Jesus. And we want to know what he thinks. We want to know what he taught. We want to know what he did. So I said, if you come to church, really, that's all we're going to be doing, is talking about him, because that's what it's all about. So we have all this evidence Jesus existed, but that very special thing about Jesus raising from the dead, that's a very powerful thing. Now, what do historians say about that? Do historians think that Jesus rose from the dead? They know he existed. Do they think he rose from the dead? Well, it depends on the historian. Some do, some don't. There's a guy named Gary Habermas. He researched every single historian who knows what they're talking about that wrote about Jesus, and he said he's got 3,400 of them that he researched, and he wanted to know, what do each of them believe? And he said more than 95% of all historians agree on the following facts. One, that Jesus was crucified. Remember, this is 95% of the people who have studied it know what they're talking about. Jesus was crucified. Two, that his followers saw Jesus alive again after he died. Most historians agree, yes, there were people that said they saw him. A third thing is that Jesus' brothers, James and Jude, they saw him after he died. A fourth thing historians agree on, Jesus' enemy, Paul, he saw him alive again after he died. And the fifth thing they all agree on is Jesus' followers all died for this belief. They died believing it was true. So, historians agree. His followers said they saw him after he died. Now, this is the next one is very interesting, that Jesus' brothers would have said they saw him after he's died. Because when Jesus was alive, his brothers didn't believe in him. His brothers made fun of him. So something happened after his death that made them change their mind and made them say, I do believe in Jesus now. I have seen him after he's dead. So it's not just his followers that are saying it. It's even people who didn't believe in Jesus, who saw him risen from the dead, and who changed their mind. That's very powerful stuff. One, Paul hated Christians. He hated the followers of Jesus. He thought they were stupid. He was trying to kill them. But what happened? Paul saw Jesus after he was dead and said, well, I must have got something wrong because this guy's risen from the dead, and then he became a follower of Jesus too. So not only did Jesus' followers say they saw him rise from the dead, his brothers who didn't believe in him, and even his enemy changed their mind because they saw Jesus rise from the dead. So this is all very powerful stuff, that it's not just he's existing, but this is changing people's lives. And all these people were killed for this belief. Now, some people die for their beliefs, but these people all died for what, if it was a lie, people don't die for a lie. They knew that it was true, and they didn't even gain anything from it, Jesus' followers. You saw Caiaphas' really fancy coffin, and then you saw Jesus' brothers' kind of plain old coffin. These people, they died poor, and they were tortured and killed for what they believed was true. Once you put all these pieces together, it presents a really powerful case that Jesus changed people's lives through his resurrection, through his raising from the dead. So these are all good reasons why we believe what we believe. And I want to finish up here so we can get to some questions. The strongest reason, I think, why we believe that Jesus is real and that he is who he says he is that we can actually know Jesus. We can actually have a relationship with him. Jesus isn't just somebody we can read about. We actually can get to know him. And above and beyond any historical reason, one of the other strongest reasons I believe in Jesus is because I just know in my heart that he's real. I've met him, I've experienced him myself, and I have a relationship with him. And the best of all, he is inviting all of us to have a relationship with him as well. A man said to a pastor once that he would be happy to believe in Jesus if the pastor could present just a watertight argument for believing in God. And the pastor said, well, what if God didn't give us a watertight argument? What if he gave us a watertight person? And Jesus, I think, is saying, I am that person. When you read about Jesus, when you get to know him, you find out that you can't argue against Jesus. People can argue about history and go back and forth, but when you get to know Jesus, you find here's really a watertight person. And for those of you who struggle with doubts, this is for you as well. Just look to Jesus and read about him, find out about him, get to know him, and in doing so, you're going to find God.